Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And when it comes to finding quality comics, there are many factors to consider. Chief among them is setting the right tone, having a style that fits that tone, and having a writer who really gets the character, even if they aren't the original creator. And for comics involving the Punisher, that tends to be quite challenging. More than any other Marvel character, comics involving him tend to be really inconsistent. It's not that they're bad, they just tend to be flat, especially for writers who just don't get Frank Castle's larger complexities. Now, to some extent, that's unavoidable. The Punisher is one of those characters who doesn't seem to lend himself to much nuance. Too many people think he's just like Batman. He just doesn't wear a mask, he isn't rich, and he's not reluctant to kill his enemies. And throughout his history, especially during his more campy anti-hero phase in the 1990s, there weren't many Punisher comic gems that stood out. Yes, they were still fun, but read one issue of Punisher War Journal, and you've read several. But then, writer Garth Ennis came along in the early 2000s and gave us the Punisher Max comics. And it's this era that, in my opinion, gave us the best iteration of Frank Castle. It ditched the battle van, it ditched the oversized guns, the flashy blue costume, and the bandana. It even ditched most references to the larger Marvel universe. It just focused on Frank Castle doing what he does best, taking on the darkest, grittiest, most inhumanly evil villains imaginable, and taking them out in ways that was as brutal as they were satisfying. And because of the max rating, artists like Doug Braithwaite could be as graphic as they wanted to be. The end result was an incredible run that captured this tone, style, depth, and persona of the Punisher to the utmost. To this day, whenever someone asks for the best Punisher comics to check out, I always refer them to Ennis's run on Punisher Max. And if that run had a high point, it was definitely the Mother Russia arc. This 6-issue story sends Frank Castle on a different kind of mission, but it's still perfectly in keeping with his never-ending war. And where it takes him, what he does, and especially how he goes about it, it's definitely befitting of a true comic gem. Now, the setup to the story is familiar, following a similar formula to previous arcs in this series. Frank finds a deserving target for his war, and this time it happens to be a ruthless Russian crime lord who managed to get released from prison. Since that never sits well with Frank, he takes it upon himself to ensure that said crime lord finishes his sentence. And the tagline here is as fitting as it is badass. If you work for the devil, you better be willing to die for him. But this task ends up being a catalyst for a much larger mission. And this time, it comes courtesy of this universe's version of Nick Fury. Now, quick side note, this comic came out in the early 2000s, and at that point, Nick Fury was still his pre-MCU David Hasselhoff version, not the Samuel L. Jackson version that more people are familiar with these days. But that actually works well here because this version of Nick Fury is a lot more grizzled. And I mean that in the best possible way. Shortly after Frank takes out the Russian mob boss, Fury comes to him with a mission. It's a bit different from the Punisher's usual battles, but it involves taking on an army of ruthless Russian criminals, so of course Frank is uniquely qualified. Fury even sweetens the deal, offering Frank access codes to every criminal database from Maine to Miami. That would essentially streamline his war, allowing him to target the worst of the worst and with the same ease as Googling a restaurant. But the nature and stakes of the mission, that's where Mother Russia really shines. It requires that Frank be more soldier than vigilante. He actually has to answer to some higher-ranking generals, and he has to work alongside a Delta Force soldier named Captain Martin Vanheim. These are all things that tap into Frank Castle's past as a Marine, but the objectives here involve more than just criminals. First, they have to fly at high altitudes in a military plane over northern Siberia. Then, they have to drop in and infiltrate a nuclear missile silo. And if they survive all that, they have to destroy a secret bioweapon program that created a nasty virus called Barbarossa. And by nasty, I mean it basically melts your flesh like Ebola on meth. Now, I'd say that's pretty brutal, but in a series like Punisher Max, it's pretty much par for the course. But there's one other complication. The only antidote to this virus is in a young girl named Galena. And in addition to destroying the bioweapons program, they need to extract her, get her to the United States, and use her to further synthesize that antidote. Now, if you think this sounds a bit too much like The Last of Us, remember, this comic came out in the early 2000s, more than several years before that game ever came out. And while the dynamics are somewhat similar, it's also something that fleshes out the Punisher in unexpected ways. Throughout his history, Frank Castle has always been very careful to target his wrath at those who deserve it. He will go out of his way to ensure no innocents get caught in the crossfire, even if it means failing to take out his target. But whenever a child is involved, this is where Frank's ruthlessness is often tempered. And it also helps remind us that he was once a father and a devout family man. So he will go out of his way for kids more than most. And that is certainly the case with Galena, who is definitely no Ellie. She's not even a teenager. She's really just a scared child. And because of the valuable medicine coursing through her body, her captors are very protective. But they're also not very kind to her. And that bothers Frank. It bothers him a lot. And at one point, he says to her that if the men are mean to her, he will be much meaner to them. And without spoiling too much, I'll just say that he definitely backs those words up. Given who he ends up facing, he kind of has to. Because as the story unfolds, we learn there's much more going on than simply stopping a renegade bioweapons program. On both the American and the Russian side, there are a lot of hidden plots and nefarious agendas. It gets real ugly fast. That tends to be the case in a Punisher Max comic. And by ugly, I mean Nick Fury takes off his belt at one point and uses it to brutally assault an American general. Trust me, you are not going to see something like that in a mainline Marvel comic, nor are you going to see the kind of dialogue that Ennis crafts with these characters. Yes, it's dark, it's profane, and it's brutal. But it works beautifully on every level. This is the Punisher at his best. This is the Punisher at his most brutal. But this is also the Punisher when his humanity shows through that brutality. It's not enough to just complete his mission and punish those who need punishing. He also has to protect an innocent girl who everyone wants to hurt for some reason or another. And while the Punisher may cross more lines than most, there are some he'll never cross. And in doing so, he shows that he's not just a ruthless vigilante killer. He's still a man. He's still a former husband and father. Losing his family didn't change that. All it did was change his mission. Punisher Max Mother Russia marked one of Frank's biggest and boldest missions. It pushed him as a man, a soldier, and a father who lost his child. And the way he rises to the challenge, fighting this war as only he can, it makes for a hell of a gem. As always, I'll place an Amazon Comixology link in the description. I'll also remind fellow comic fans that this is a Max title. It is not for the faint of heart. And it's also not the kind of thing you'll ever see in the MCU. But if you can stomach it and Frank Castle's brutal methods, it is a worthy comic book gem to any collection. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please stay tuned for more of my comic book gems, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care and stay safe.